You get a bad piece of chicken, for instance, you got salmonella or maybe E. coli, and you got diarrhea for a couple of days. And then you have irritable bowel syndrome for up to 5 years. So the microbiome, Rena, is proving to be shockingly, surprisingly much more potent than we ever thought.
Dr. William Davis is a leading expert in the gut microbiome.
His best-selling books have helped millions of people fix their gut and heal chronic diseases, and it starts with one microbe.
But there's easily over 150 million people with SIBO. It's everywhere. I've had it. There are many what I call telltale signs. Nightshades, the histamine-containing foods, all those terrible food intolerances, those are all SIBO. Now here's the problem. People will say things like, well, I eliminated whatever problematic food there was. But if you don't correct the SIBO, there's trouble ahead.
What's the problems?
There's weight gain. There's depression. This process is probably one of the most important drivers of cancer risk and coronary disease and dementia. So it's not good to say, I'm going to eliminate some food and just accept the consequences. That's not a solution.
Okay, I have to ask about probiotics. Do you think that's a good idea?
Probiotics can be helpful, but they're probably the least important of all things. At the top of the list of all things, I love this, it's just fermented foods. What if I said the solution can be something as simple and accessible as something that looks like yogurt? It's not yogurt. That you make in your kitchen. And it has so far in our hands about 90% effectiveness in eradicating SIBO. But there's other benefits, especially that reuteri.
This episode features Dr. William Davis, and we're discussing the simple way to fix your gut health. And it starts with one microbe, and you can do it at home. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because we know that real food is medicine. And by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share the message to millions more people that need to hear the truth. And now for the episode with Dr. William Davis. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, the gut microbiome plays an integral part of our health. In fact, we have 10 trillion cells in our body, and we also have 100 trillion bacteria or microbes. And when this bacteria gets dysbiotic or unbalanced, it causes a host of problems in our body. So today, Dr. Davis is going to share his decades of research and experience. We're going to talk about how the gut microbiome is closely connected to chronic disease, the one microbe that you need that's going to fix your gut, and the very easy yogurt recipe that's going to heal your gut and also reverse aging. So Dr. Davis, my first question, if someone has just clicked on this video and they're thinking, I have so many different problems, I don't know where to start, why should they first look at the gut microbiome?
Well, there's actually, I break my programs down, Rena, into two parts: microbiome strategies and things that precede the microbiome. These are basic things: changes in diet, addressing common nutrient deficiencies unique to modern life, like vitamin D, magnesium, iodine, omega-3 fatty acids. They may be a little boring now, but they all do add to phenomena such as minimizing insulin resistance, skin rashes, diabetes, heart disease. Because if you change your microbiome in that context, you get bigger and better effects, because all those things actually have microbiome implications. For instance, people often don't know that fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, are a major factor in influencing the intestinal barrier to unhealthy microbes. Vitamin D, likewise. Magnesium propels the passage of food through the 30 feet of gastrointestinal tract. So while those little things like magnesium, iodine, omega-3 seem like old-fashioned, they still matter. And then we address the microbiome, and spectacular things, even bigger, better things happen in that context.
Absolutely. The gut microbiome is such an exceptional area of, interest these days. I want to talk about how the gut microbiome is related to all these chronic diseases that we're seeing: dementia, diabetes, insulin resistance. Can we talk more about that?
Well, the big thing that it plays out in all those conditions is something called endotoxemia. And all that means is, so we know that the colon is where microbes are supposed to live. These are species like E. coli and salmonella and Campylobacter, which, by the way, Rena, those names may be familiar to your listeners because they're the same species as food poisoning, because they come from fecal contamination. It's horrible to think about, right? Your fast food was contaminated by some kid who didn't wash his hands after going number 2. Well, those fecal microbes are supposed to stay in the colon. And the colon's pretty well adapted to that. What your GI tract is not adapted to is having those same microbes ascend into the 24 feet 24 feet of small intestine, the ileum, jejunum, duodenum, and stomach. And the small intestine is not well equipped to handle that because it has a very thin mucus barrier to protect itself. It's very permeable. That's where we're supposed to absorb nutrients like amino acids and vitamins and minerals. So when you have the invasion of fecal microbes, which is in the US, it's terrible. It's half the US population. It's probably the biggest epidemic ever in the history of our species, where fecal microbes have ascended into the 24 feet of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. SIBO, we say SIBO, SIBO. So when you have trillions of fecal microbes invading the small intestine, they don't live very long. They live for a few hours. And they die, release their toxic components that enter the bloodstream. And that's called endotoxemia. But this is how microbes in the GI tract can be experienced as rosacea or psoriasis in the skin, or as cognitive impairment and dementia in the brain, or as panic or anxiety or depression or suicidal thoughts from effects on the brain, or coronary disease, or weight gain in the abdomen, obesity and overweight, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver. In other words, we've got to reconsider all the things we thought we knew about health in light of this major contribution of the microbiome through this process called endotoxemia.
Is that related to these endotoxemia and the endotoxins? There's something called LPS. Is that one type of endotoxin that gets into the bloodstream and then releases all these toxins, causing inflammation and disease?
Exactly. Lipopolysaccharide, or as you say, LPS endotoxin, is the primary. There are others, but that's the primary one. Unfortunately, I know in the US we can't measure it outside of clinical studies, so it's not an easy thing to assess. So you've got to determine whether you have this SIBO process indirectly. Do you know about these devices? This is what we've been relying on.
This is the AIR device.
Yes, the AIR device, AIRE. So I don't want your listeners to think that they must run out and get one. You don't have to. But it's one of the things to be aware of. It's a tool that measures hydrogen gas on the breath, because microbes produce hydrogen gas, but we can't. And you can use it as a mapping device. You ingest something that microbes will metabolize, and then you see how fast hydrogen gas is produced. If it's produced within the first 90 minutes, you must have fecal microbes in the upper GI tract, in the duodenum and jejunum. And that's one way to tell whether you have this peculiar process of SIBO. There are other ways too. There are many what I call telltale signs. So this proliferation of food intolerances, to FODMAPs, to nightshades, to histamine-containing foods, all those terrible food intolerances, those are all SIBO. There's nothing wrong with the food that your great-grandmother used to eat, no problem. But modern people say things like, I can only eat 7 foods. Everything else makes me sick. That's SIBO. Now, here's the problem. People will say things like, well, I eliminated whatever problematic food there was, or long list of foods. But if you don't correct the SIBO, there's trouble ahead. There's weight gain. There's depression. There's risk for various forms of cancer. This process is probably one of the most important drivers of cancer risk, for instance, and coronary disease and dementia. I mean, so it's not good to say, I'm going to eliminate some food and just accept the consequences. That's not a solution. It's a temporary Band-Aid. There are conditions where the SIBO is so likely to be present, you can safely assume you have it. Fibromyalgia is one of those. Virtually 100% likelihood you have SIBO. Fatty liver. Obesity, at least 50% likelihood. Type 2 diabetes, about a 50% likelihood. A lot of psychiatric or psychological issues, very high likelihood. So now, if I said, Rita, the solution to this is to surgically remove your small intestine, you would say, well, you better be damn certain that's true, Buster, right? Well, what if I said the solution can be something as simple and accessible as something that looks like yogurt? It's not yogurt, that you make in your kitchen and you have with some blueberries. And it has so far in our hands about 90% effectiveness in eradicating SIBO. So I call it SIBO yogurt, which I kind of regret because it makes people think it's only good for SIBO. It's not. It's actually replacing microbes that you should have gotten from your mom at birth and during breastfeeding. But she may have lost because she got antibiotics, or you may have lost because you got antibiotics and other factors. So all we're doing is replacing microbes that you've lost. But they're very unique microbes, because if it was any microbe, you could just say, well, I'll just take a probiotic off the shelf, take a probiotic, and the SIBO will go away. It does not go away. So what I've done is chose species and strains that take up residence in the small intestine. That's where all this occurs, and produce what are called bacteriocins. These are natural antibiotics that kill fecal microbes. So I chose the two primary microbes that play the biggest role: Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri. Both are powerhouses of bacteriocin production. Now, optionally, we add a third microbe, such as Bacillus coagulans. I'm not convinced it's necessary, but that's an option for some people. Some people have the SIBO so bad. These are people who say things like, I took antibiotics for 3 years for acne or something like that. They have it really bad. But we do it typically for 4 weeks. We use my method of prolonged fermentation. Microbes, as you know, don't have sex. There's no male and female microbes. They just double themselves. Well, reuteri, for instance, doubles every 3 hours at human body temperature. So we're going to ferment it for 36 hours. It doubles 12 times. We count the microbes using a method called flow cytometry. We get 300 billion per half cup or 120 milliliter serving. So what we're trying to do is get super duper big numbers so that you have a running chance of pushing back all those fecal microbes invading your small intestine. And it works. So far, in about 75, 80 people, it's been about 90% effective in normalizing breath hydrogen gas. Not that you have to have the hydrogen gas measuring device, but that's how we could tell when somebody responded. But typical story, somebody does this, they think they have SIBO, they consume the yogurt for 4 weeks, longer if they have it really bad, and it helps to have some kind of a sign. So if you have an intolerance, say to tomatoes, maybe after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, you can try a little piece of tomato, see if you tolerate it now. And if you do, you now know you got rid of your SIBO. Now, one of the reasons why I regret calling it SIBO yogurt is because it's also helpful. So if you do it, say, for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever, it helps to do it periodically, twice, 3 times a week or so, because not only does it prevent recurrence, but there's other benefits, especially that reuteri. Ladies love it because they start to lose their crow's feet and other wrinkles. Guys love it because they experience a restoration of youthful musculature. There's an increase in libido. There's an amplification of the immune response. In other words, there's other effects. And by the way, effects, Rena, that you might say amount to a reversal of aging, partial reversal of some of the phenomena of aging. So smoother skin, increased libido, better immune response. Your toenails and fingernails grow faster. Your hair grows faster. So it's really interesting. That's the reuteri. So there's value to continuing it even after you've eradicated SIBO.
I want to talk more about this L-reuteri in terms of the recipe for the yogurt, but there's other things that we can do. So you mentioned a lot there in terms of the air device for testing the yogurt. I do want to spend some time going into that, but you can see that the gut microbiome plays an integral role with our whole health. It's interesting, you being a cardiologist, you've made the connection between the gut microbiome and the connection between small, dense LDL.
Yes. So unfortunately, right, the last 30, 40 years, everyone's been obsessed with reducing saturated fat, total fat, cholesterol, and reducing cholesterol with these drugs. This is nonsense. That whole idea should have been discarded 40 years ago. The shame of all this is that focus took everyone's attention off the real causes for heart disease, which are readily identified, but not through cholesterol testing, and readily managed. The downside of all this is you can essentially eradicate risk for heart disease with little to no cost in the comfort of your kitchen. Doesn't even have to involve the doctor, and you have magnificent control over cardiovascular risk. And it has nothing to do with cholesterol. It has to do with, as you point out, the eradication of small, dense LDL particles. So years ago, I asked, because I was seeing patients, we helped publish these data. If you put one of the ways this all happened 35 years ago was I set up a CT heart scan device in Wisconsin, where I was living at the time, one of the first scanners in the country. And we're scanning people for asymptomatic coronary disease by scoring calcium. Calcium is a kind of a dipstick for how much atherosclerotic plaque you have. When you look for hidden heart disease, Rena, you find it everywhere. So these are people like, they say, I'm 52, my mom died of a heart attack at 65. Is that in my future? We scan her, normal is 0, maybe her score is only 100. But that means within 7-8 years, she's going to die, need a procedure like bypass operation, or have sudden cardiac death or a heart attack. So it's a crystal ball. What's in your future? Well, back then, we helped publish these data. The best we had 35 years ago, baby aspirin, high-dose cholesterol drug like Lipitor, 40 milligrams, low-fat, low-saturated fat diet, exercise program. So if you do nothing, the score goes up 25% per year. So 100, 125, 100, whatever, 68, like that. And it goes up real fast over the years. What if you put somebody on all those, the baby aspirin, low-fat diet, high-dose Lipitor, exercise? It goes up 25% per year. Rena, has no effect. My colleagues to this day call that optimal medical therapy that has no effect on halting the progression of plaque. So it took a lot of zigzagging, trial and error, but it led to all kinds of new observations, like adding vitamin D. When I added vitamin D at a dose sufficient to achieve a 25 hydroxy vitamin D blood level of 60 to 70, it was the first time we saw scores drop. A score of 700, which is terrible, would drop to 390 or 410 or something like that. First time we saw regression. It led to the appreciation that cholesterol is useless, but lipoprotein testing to quantify those small, dense LDL particles, that really worked. And, the science has been worked out for over 30 years. What things cause small, dense LDL particles? Wheat, grain, and sugars. Not fat, not bacon, not cheese, not beef, not butter, not olive oil. Wheat, grains, and sugars. Clear and simple. And since then, 55 clinical trials have been done validating the idea that small, dense LDL is a far superior predictor of heart disease than LDL cholesterol or total cholesterol. So I discard those cholesterol measures long ago. And so we take wheat, grains, and sugars out of the diet, small LDL. If you do a method called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, it'll drop from like 2,000 nanomoles per liter, particle count per volume, to 0, or some other very low number. In other words, it was so easy to get rid of at no cost, essentially. But that's when I also saw all kinds of other things happen. I saw type 2 diabetics get off their insulin and diabetes drugs. I saw people with high blood pressure get off 3 blood pressure medications. I saw people with skin rashes, with neurodegenerative conditions. I saw all kinds of diseases start to recede. It became clear. In this case, it was also amplified by the elimination of wheat, grains, and sugars. That's extremely powerful strategy. But when you think about it, all the things we're doing, the diet, vitamin D, omega-3s, magnesium, the microbiome, all we're doing is restoring human life to the way it should have been all along. We are well adapted to life on this planet until such things as processed, ultra-processed food manufacturers, and sadly, dietary guidelines get in the way.
Absolutely. I want to talk about what is the gut microbiome because we've been speaking about microbes, bacteria. You mentioned the yogurt, which we're going to talk about a bit later. So what is the gut microbiome and what are microbes?
So they're mostly bacteria, but there's other things too. There's viruses, which are very poorly explored. There's fungi. Fungi can be good too. Fungi are everywhere. They're in your hair. They're in your kitchen utensils, kitchen counter. They're everywhere. As well as archaea, which is a very recently appreciated class of microbes that predate bacteria evolutionarily. But it's unclear whether they are really a problem or not. But mostly it's dominated by bacteria of a variety of sorts. And so there are bacteria that do good things for us. These are bacteria like Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium, Lactospiraceae, Lactobacillus, like our friend reuteri and Gasseri. And then there are species that, as long as they're kept at a minimal level, won't bother you. These are those fecal microbes, the E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter. But I always think about this. So those microbes are fine. They're supposed to be in your colon unless they overproliferate and then ascend, or if you're exposed to food contaminated by those same microbes. So those microbes are fine as long as they stay where they belong in the colon, but they're not fine when they get into the small intestine, whether it came in orally or came up by ascending.
That's when we go out and eat something a bit off, or some raw meat or some uncooked chicken. Woo, some diarrhea comes out and then you might get all sick. That's what's happening.
Yep, yep. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often because it can be pretty awful to get that. Dr. Mark Pimentel at UCLA Cedars-Sinai described a syndrome he calls post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome. That's a real thing. You get a bad piece of chicken, for instance, you got salmonella or maybe E. coli, and you got diarrhea for a couple of days maybe, and then you have irritable bowel syndrome for up to 5 years after that. Something happens weird in your intestines, and he's described it in detail. But that's a real phenomenon. But it highlights how awful it can be when fecal microbes get into the small intestine where they don't belong.
I want to talk about fecal microbes and the anatomy of the GI tract. But first question for you. I see your best-selling book, Wheat Belly, behind you. Beautiful. You were a cardiologist, a heart doctor for decades. How'd you get interested in the microbiome and gut health?
You know, Rena, I wish I could tell you because I do some deep thinking, come to smart conclusions. No, blunders. Blunders and mistakes. And so it started when my mom died of sudden cardiac death, about 4 months after her 2-vessel coronary angioplasty. Rena, that's what I was doing at the time. I was doing angioplasty and atherectomy and stent implantation in another city. And then I get the call, my mom died uh, of the disease I was taking care of. So, but it drove home to me. Here I am in the hospital laboratory, fixing people's arteries, opening them up. But there are people dying in the ambulance or found dead in their kitchen or bedroom. So heart disease is not something that always gives you warning. So it became clear taking care of this disease in a laboratory was as woefully inadequate. So back then, this is 35, maybe 37 years now, but a long time ago, I asked, what could I have done to tell my mom, hey, Mom, 2 years from now, 5 years now, whatever, bad thing's going to happen. What can we do now to prevent it? Well, back then, this is still largely true. It was a CT heart scan that generated a coronary calcium score. My friend Dr. John Rumberger developed this science when he was at Mayo Clinic, and he showed that calcium is a dipstick for the amount of total atherosclerotic plaque. And then Dr. Arthur Agatston of South Beach Diet, that guy, he developed a scoring system. So this all took place over the last 35 years. And you scanned people left and right. And it became clear when we did lipoprotein testing, it was the small LDL particle that's the driver, caused by wheat grains and sugars, amplified by insulin resistance, driven by phenomena such as poor diet, lack of vitamin D, lack of magnesium, lack of omega-3 fatty acids, and the endotoxemia of SIBO. So we address all those things, and your listeners, when they do this, it's a little complicated perhaps at first, but once you get it, all we're doing is mimicking the lifestyle of humans before all this mess started, and you're given magnificent control over coronary disease. So it's very common for us to have regression or reversal of coronary disease. We don't even have to talk about stents and bypass surgery and sudden cardiac death. So one of the things you can track is that coronary calcium scoring. You can reduce the scores. In fact, it's quite easy to do.
I want to talk about the things that destroy your microbiome. And there's a whole list. I know that we're going through so many different things here. So if we can talk about things one by one, before we get to the things that destroy the microbiome, it's first good to understand the gastrointestinal tract, the mouth, the small intestines, the large intestines, the rectum. That's just a brief overview because that's connected obviously to the gut microbiome. If people can understand where it starts, the mouth, small intestines, large intestines, and rectum, they'll understand this whole story. Can we talk about the mouth? What is it responsible for in terms of overall gut health and the microbes associated with it?
It's an evolving world, but it's become clear that any kind of disruption of dental health, whether it's cavities or bleeding gums or gingivitis or periodontitis, you start to proliferate unhealthy microbial species. And the interesting thing about that, Irina, is that now we know with pretty good evidence that the mouth microbiome may be a major driving factor in colon cancer. So, for instance, the Fusobacterium nucleatum species that is present in your mouth, you floss or brush any micro trauma, and they enter your bloodstream and colonize the colon. So I have a friend who's a functional dentist, Dr. Debbie Osment in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She'll test the oral microbiome and the stool microbiome, and she'll find Fusobacterium in both, especially if they've been diagnosed with colon cancer. So that's one. Another really interesting connection is dementia, cognitive impairment. People have porphyromonas in the mouth that colonizes the brain. And now it's not quite clear if that's causal. Is it cause and effect, or is it just an accompaniment? It's a hard thing to prove these kinds of things. In other words, to really prove it, we'd have to say, okay, we're going to give you porphyromonas in your mouth and see if it causes dementia. No one's going to do that. So we have to rely on animal models and some indirect evidence. But it's become clear a real hotbed for trouble are people on stomach acid blocking drugs, like the Protonics, Prilosec, Acifex, those drugs. Because stomach acid is an important barrier, as you know, both to the descent of oral microbes and to the ascent of fecal microbes. So when you lose stomach acid, you've opened the door to colonization of the stomach. And people can have their stomachs filled with bacteria. And that, of course, leads to all kinds of problems of their own. And a lot of people developed autoimmune gastritis, where it's an autoimmune disease where it attacks the cells that produce stomach acid. And those people also lose the capacity for producing stomach acid. And same kind of thing, SIBO and colonization of the stomach with oral microbes. And of course, H. pylori, that comes from Australian science, right? H. pylori is the microbe that causes ulcers as well as stomach cancer, but before it leads to stomach cancer, also leads to autoimmune gastritis, and you lose the capacity to produce stomach acid. So while we celebrated 40 years ago, we celebrated all the appearance of these stomach acid blocking drugs, but they've proven to be a two-edged sword. Yeah, they can reduce stomach acid that comes, say, from stress, but they also take you down the path of a major disruption of the microbiome and then other diseases.
As Dr. Davis mentions, the microbiome is so important for optimal health and is closely connected to chronic disease. And while what we eat is so important for the microbiome and our health, we also need to get regular blood work done to understand changes in our metabolic health, especially when we make changes to our diet. And I personally have been getting regular blood work done because, like you, I want to take control of my health with data without the guesswork. And we've seen a massive rise in chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, thyroid imbalances have all increased, especially in younger people. So knowing what's happening inside your body is so important for prevention. And that's why comprehensive testing is so important. And that's why I have Function Health as a sponsor of this episode. Function is an all-in-one health platform that starts with over 100 advanced lab tests covering your entire body: heart, hormones, kidney, liver, autoimmunity, cancer signals, toxins, nutrients, plus so much more. And while traditional healthcare only covers about 19 biomarkers, Function goes 5 times deeper, offering you a complete picture of what's happening inside your body. And I am really excited about testing and optimizing my hormones because we know this directly affects mood, weight gain, energy, and sleep. And I'm particularly looking at testosterone, estrogen, a full thyroid panel apart from just TSH, and cortisol. And don't worry, I'm very excited about sharing all my results with you. One thing I love about Function Health is that it's affordable and widely accessible with an annual membership of $499, which covers over 100 lab tests with their nationwide lab partner in over 2,000 locations. Compare this with traditional healthcare costs, which can reach up to $15,000 for the exact same test. So if you'd like to try Function Health, just head to functionhealth.com/primal podcast. Function currently has a waitlist, but they're offering my viewers the chance to skip it. Just head to the link in the description of this episode. Next one is let's bypass the esophagus to small intestines. That's where a lot of disease happens.
I think, Rena, that it's the loss of small intestinal colonizing species. It's a short list, but on that list is Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, those two I mentioned before, and probably some of the spore-forming microbes like Bacillus coagulans and Bacillus subtilis. They don't colonize the small intestine, but they germinate in the small intestine. So the loss of microbes that had the capacity to essentially police the small intestine, I think, is probably one of the big reasons why we have this problem now. Because when we restore those microbes, lo and behold, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, seems to go away. But so those lost microbes are just three among the hundreds we've lost. Uh, it seems like every day we discover that there's another microbe that we've lost. So that list is growing rapidly, and this science is evolving very rapidly. But as we talked about off camera, one of the sad things is that the practicing physician is so woefully out of touch with the science that they'll still say things like, "Oh, probiotics have been shown not to work. Don't play with your microbe. It corrects itself." I mean, wildly crazy, ignorant things. And so that's why I'm excited, because it means you and me, and people like us, and health coaches and functional medicine docs have the opportunity to intervene and help people recover, fix a broken microbiome, and obtain, we're talking about smoother skin, for God's sake. We're talking about a restoration of youthful musculature. One of the things that happens with reuteri, for instance, is it provokes the release of oxytocin from the brain, the hormone of love and empathy. So people will experience an increase in generosity, in empathy, in the desire for human connection, and greater acceptance of other people's opinions. So, in other words, yeah, it's great for your body, what I call body shape, composition, and skin, but it's also good for social reasons. At a time of record social isolation, even pre-pandemic, record divorce, of course, and I didn't know this until recently, the psychology community has been formally measuring and tracking the rise in narcissistic behavior that's occurred since 1963. The curve is an upward 45-degree incline. So, for example, true or false, I am a very important person in this world. 1963, 13% of people say, yes, I am. Our time, 83% of people. Now, maybe it's not just reuteri and the loss of oxytocin. Maybe it's social media. Maybe it's consumerist behavior. Maybe other things here. But you and I and our listeners don't have any control over that. But we do have control over restoring this microbe and thereby oxytocin. And people will say things like, you know what? My relationship is better. I feel closer to my partner. I tolerate the quirks of my family and coworkers better. I introduce myself to strangers in line for coffee at Starbucks. So it's changing social behavior as well as physical behavior.
It's all these bacteria, these microbes that we need. So microbes are a host of different things, fungi, archaea, bacteria, all these different things that we need. But it's a loss of them from our processed foods and our lifestyle that is causing all this disruption in our life, mental health disorders, chronic health disorders. We spoke about the small intestines that is responsible for absorbing things. There's not lots of microbes and bacteria. That's more in the large intestine. Is that correct?
So there's a gradient. As you go from the stomach to the duodenum, to the jejunum, to the ileum, there's an increase in numbers. But there's still relatively low numbers compared to the colon. Colon's packed with trillions. But as you ascend, it should be less. That's why this is such an abnormal situation where there's an increased density of microbes in the small intestine in SIBO. But the other interesting thing here is what's become clear is new methods. So years ago, all we did was culture microbes. We take a swab of sputum, urine, fecal material, phlegm, whatever, and you swab a petri dish and you see what grows. Well, that you can't culture the vast majority of microbes that colonize the human body. So that's why these new DNA methods have opened up this entire universe of microbes, including in places we thought shouldn't have microbes. So it's become clear, for instance, that the bladder, the urinary bladder, has its own microbiome. The prostate gland, the uterus, they have their own microbiomes. The airway, the brain, they all have their own unique signature microbiomes. The vagina is especially important. I've been thinking a lot about that because I have 2 new grandkids. And their mom, so 2 years old, soon 3 and 1. And I quizzed them. I said, did the OB tell you about the importance of Lactobacillus crispatus or Bifidobacterium infantis? So crispatus is essential for vaginal health because if a woman restores crispatus, many have lost it, from antibiotics and other things. You restore it, and the risk of miscarriage goes way down. The risk of premature labor goes way down. Because, premature delivery of a child can be catastrophic for a lifetime if that child survives. So having a way to postpone or slow down delivery till term is a very important thing. And later in life, restores vaginal moisture, reduces risk of STDs, huge effects. Bifidobacteria infantis. Mom should give it to that child at birth and then breastfeed, and it allows the child to properly metabolize the human milk oligosaccharides that allow brain maturation. If the child doesn't have infantis, even if it breastfeeds, it doesn't have normal neurological maturation. So restoring that microbe in the child is very critical. It becomes the dominant microbe in a child's microbiome. Babies' microbiome are very different from adults. We have hundreds, thousands of species. They're dominated by one species. Like 80 to 90% of the entire microbiome is Bifidobacteria infantis. If they don't have it because mom didn't give it to them, you have impaired maturation. So that's just a sample of the incredible things that are emerging from, and by the way, if a woman restores Lactobacillus crispatus, the risk of repeated urinary tract infections plummets. And the likelihood of incontinence, urge or stress incontinence, coughing and peeing, very embarrassing, right? And the conventional solutions are horrible. They're horrible. Of course, the conventional solutions for repeated urinary tract infections is antibiotic after antibiotic. And every time a woman takes an antibiotic, her health declines, her health deteriorates. We're here and now the bladder has a microbiome, and we restore the lost microbes like Lactobacillus crispatus, and in many instances, freed from all those problems. So the microbiome, Rena, is proving to be shockingly, surprisingly much more potent than we ever thought.
I was trying to make it more simple, but I mean, it seems like it can't be so simple. And it seems like, scientists and doctors are learning about the different microbiomes in the whole body. But I think that we can make it very simple to the audience to understand what are some things that kill the microbiome. Don't do these things so that you can have optimal health. Number one is avoid sugar, wheat, and grains. Why?
Because it tends to cultivate species that like sugar. So we don't think of grains as being sugary, but they're very sugary because the amylopectin A carbohydrate unique to grains feeds microbes. I think that's more of a SIBO issue, small intestinal fungal we haven't even touched on that. That is, a lot of people have fungal overgrowth in the colon and then up into the small intestine. And this is very concerning because, diabetics are walking laboratories for what happens when blood glucose goes high. If somebody's a diabetic, type 1 or type 2, not only is their blood level of glucose high, but their tears are higher, their saliva is higher, their sweat is higher in sugar, their muscle, their skin, the entire body's filled with sugar. That's why it's very common for poorly controlled diabetics to have fungal infections all throughout their body, behind the ears, in the scalp, under the breasts, in the groin, on the toenails, fingernails, and most concerning of all, the brain. So there's good research out of Spain showing that people with dementia have brains filled with fungal species. Now, how causal are they? That's not clear. Once again, it's hard to prove, right? If I said, Rena, we're going to give you fungi and see if it colonizes your brain, no one's going to do that. But it's looking as if fungi play a much bigger role than we ever thought. And that's largely cultivated by anything that converts to sugar. And here's a crazy thing. So one of the signs of fungal overgrowth in the gastrointestinal tract is sugar cravings. Now, wait a minute. If fungi love sugar because they metabolize it quite effectively, and they somehow get hold of you in your GI tract and cause you to have sugar crave, they must somehow produce metabolite that drives appetite. No one's identified it yet. But it's a great example, I think, how microbes can control human behavior. By the way, one of the big signs of SIBO and SIFO is anger, hatred, frustration, depression, suicide as well. So I think a lot of the things, because we're seeing it recede. That is, people say, I'm angry all the time. I'm just frustrated. I hate my job. I hate my partner. My kids piss me off. They correct their SIBO, SIFO, and they say, I have a level of calm I haven't had in years. But it's an illustration of the powerful effect the microbiome has on emotional and social health.
So if you have sugar cravings, that is a sign of a poor microbiome, gut microbiome, overall microbiome. Interesting. Okay, let's talk about worst offenders when it comes to wheat and grains. What's the worst of the worst?
Well, the worst is this thing called modern high-yield semi-dwarf wheat. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a research project funded by the U.S. government, Mexican government, and the Rockefeller Foundation east of Mexico City. It was well intended, Rena. It was a project to increase yield per acre of wheat, corn, and soy. So they introduced huge genetic changes into those plants. Well, the end result with wheat was it converted it from a 4.5, 5 foot tall plant to an 18-inch tall, thick stalk, large seed head, large seed plant. It looks very different. It is very different. They changed the genetics and the biochemistry of this plant, and then further changes have been introduced over time. So, for instance, farmers, so when you change a plant, you don't say, now we're going to have to perform human clinical trials to prove safety. They don't do that. They just sell it to you. But farmers love some of the components of modern wheat, such as wheat germ agglutinin, which is a potent bowel toxin, and phytates that bind minerals, magnesium, calcium, iron, zinc, and you poop it out. Well, farmers and agricultural geneticists have selected strains with enrichment in those things because they provide resistance to pests, to insects, and molds. So modern wheat, changed by massive genetic experiments and then cultivated for increased content of such things as wheat germ agglutinin and phytates, that makes them even more toxic to humans. So they've created this monster, and it was released in the American public about mid to late 1980s. And that's what's so virtually everything made of wheat nowadays is from high yield semi-dwarf wheat. Not to say that ancestral forms are harmless. They're not. They are harmful, but they're all the adverse effects were amplified by all this genetics research. One of the questions I asked is this. So, well, okay, if modern high yield semi-dwarf wheat's so bad, what if we go back in time? Middle Ages, Roman times, pre-agriculture. What if we go all the way back to the ancestral wild form of wheat, which is einkorn wheat, 14 chromosomes. By the way, modern wheat is 42 chromosomes. I have 46 chromosomes. Rena has 46 chromosomes. All your listeners have. We're all human. But think about that. Modern wheat, 42 chromosomes. Ancestral wild wheat, 14 chromosomes. They're very, very different. But that wheat, so what happened to the first humans who made the mistake in desperation, famine, war, drought, whatever reason, they turned to seeds of grasses. That's what wheat is. And they learned how to pulverize it, dry it, turn it into porridge. And then during Egyptian times, they learned how to make beer and then leaven bread. What happened to those first humans who consumed wild wheat as a porridge? Well, explosion in tooth decay. Here's something remarkable. Before the consumption of wheat and grains, tooth decay was almost unknown. Very uncommon to find evidence of cavities, abscess, tooth loss, misalignment. At a time when there was no dentists, no dental floss, no fluoridated toothpaste, none of that stuff. And yet only 1 to 3% of all teeth recovered showed decay, abscess, etc. With the addition of wheat and grains to the diet, 16 to 49% of all teeth recovered showed decay, abscess, etc. There was also an explosion in arthritis. There was also the appearance of widespread deficiencies, especially of iron. So the phytates of wheat and grains bind iron very strongly. So if you have a sandwich or a bagel or some pretzels, the phytates bind all the iron in your diet, and you poop it out. You pass out in the toilet. And that's why iron deficiency, sometimes very severe, is one of the phenomena associated with wheat consumption.
So are you saying that if we have something like healthy porridge or oatmeal, that is probably not the best for us?
Well, of course, oatmeal is oats. That's a little bit different. That's largely a carbohydrate issue. So oats have so a lot of the adverse effects of grains can be blamed on the proteins, like the gliadin protein within gluten. That same protein in oats is called avenin, and it's not as harmful as the gliadin. For instance, the gliadin protein of wheat is known to be the initiating factor in autoimmune diseases. especially rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes. Probably doesn't occur with the adenine protein, but oats still have the amylopectin A carbohydrate that raises blood glucose and causes heart disease more so than table sugar. So that's why if it doesn't have one bad thing, it doesn't mean it can't have other bad things. So the analogy I often draw is if you have unfiltered full tar cigarettes that cause lung cancer and heart disease, now you have filtered low tar cigarettes. Is that now good for you? Of course not. So same kind of analogy.
I just wanted to make that clarification in terms of, because people think that oats are really healthy and have oatmeal and porridge. What about things like barley, rice, amaranth, quinoa? Anything bad in those? Should we exclude those?
Yeah, so I don't know of any way to make grains healthy because humans, if heaven forbid, you and your family are starving, haven't eaten anything in 2 weeks, and you come upon a field of grains, whether it's barley or wheat or rice or maize, there's no such thing as corn in the wild world. That's a mutation. Would you say, thank goodness, we now can feast? No. Grains and they're grasses. They're all seeds of grasses, are not viewed as. So it is testimony to the cleverness of humans, ancient humans, who learned how to turn it into food. But it's not food. So all those things have varying degrees. So even at the most benign end of grains is rice. It has almost none of that protein relative gliadin, but it does have wheat germ agglutinin. Even though it's in rice, it's called wheat germ agglutinin because it's identical in structure. And wheat germ agglutinin is a very potent bowel toxin. And rice, of course, almost pure sugar. People don't think of it that way, but the amylopectin A is a very potent sugar. And of course, now we know from our own USDA that there's arsenic in rice. And farmers did not do that. We can't blame farmers for that. This is just the natural behavior of the rice plant. It's a concentrator of arsenic from the soil. So I know of no way to make grains healthy for you. There are various degrees of harmful. At the extreme, most harmful of all, modern high-yield semi-dwarf wheat. At the most benign end, rice, but still not benign.
I also wanted to mention, because you mentioned gluten, but anything gluten-free is a no-no as well.
Yeah, isn't that evil? That's right. So whenever something goes wrong in diet, there's always someone right there to profit from it. So the gluten-free industry has come to rely on cornstarch, tapioca starch, potato flour, and cornstarch. Did I say cornstarch? Whatever. Four common ingredients in gluten-free foods. So very few foods raise blood glucose and insulin higher than wheat flour, the amylopectin A of wheat. What are the foods worse than wheat? Cornstarch, rice flour, tapioca starch, potato flour. It's like a cruel joke, and yet it's offered as something healthy. Now, it doesn't have the proteins that have all those effects like provocation of autoimmune diseases, but it has highly digestible starches that lead to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, dementia. So they're horrible foods, yet they're often held up as healthy replacements. Of course, they're not.
I want to ask you about vegetable seed oils. Do you think that kills the microbiome?
No, I think that whole conversation has been overblown somewhat. Omega-6, so people say things like, I'm going to avoid omega-6. Well, you're going to die. Omega-6 is like linoleic acid are essential. You can't just do away with them. What's in question is whether wild overexposure in the absence of omega-3. In other words, if all you do is get corn oil, mixed vegetable oil, and soybean oil, and very little in the way of omega-3s, like EPA, DHA from fish oil, seafood, and the linoleic acid of flaxseed, chia seed, etc., is that harmful? Maybe. That evidence is poor. I don't think you should use those oils, but you're still getting omega-6 by eating meat and chicken. And so you don't want to avoid them. You just don't want that wild overexposure. But if you free yourself of processed, ultra-processed foods, your intake of linoleic acid, omega-6, plummets automatically. But if you had like a ratio of 3 to 1, say, omega-6 to omega-3, some people say 1 to 1 is ideal. The evidence does not tell us that's harmful to you.
It's important to put it into context. Omega-6s are important in the body, but not so much the high amount. Next one, you'll probably be very much like, no, antibiotics.
So, yeah, it's clear antibiotics in the century since penicillin was introduced, and now dozens of others, that clearly is a major factor in causing a lot of these problems. So it's almost the rule. Somebody says, I've got SIBO, I've got endotoxemia, and I'm experiencing it as rheumatoid arthritis and depression and skin rosacea or Parkinson's disease. They almost always have a history of repeated prolonged antibiotic exposure. So that is a big problem. We can't do away with antibiotics, of course, but we want to minimize our exposure to them. There's probably more to it, though. There's a recent study from New Guinea, for instance, and there's a population in the highlands who actually they eat wild foods, they kill animals, they dig in the dirt for roots and tubers, gather birds' eggs, those kinds of things, but they also oddly take a lot of antibiotics. And they don't have the same degree of SIBO and dysbiosis that we do. So there's clearly antibiotics are a problem, no question. But there's something else going on too.
What about glyphosate that kills the microbiome?
We don't have human data, but it's virtually guaranteed that glyphosate, because it's, as you know, it's an antibiotic. When Monsanto filed its initial patents, they filed patents as both an herbicide and an antibiotic. But it turned out to be the worst kind of antibiotic because it kills beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus species, and it doesn't kill fecal microbes. So glyphosate essentially selects for the unhealthy species. And of course, it becomes so ridiculously ubiquitous too.
Okay, I have to ask about probiotics. The ones that you go to the pharmacy or your drugstore and you're like, probiotics. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's an okay idea. Here's the problem with we call it probiotics 1.0. Or even 2.0. This is how most companies formulate a probiotic. Oh, we think Bifidobacteria infantis, throw it in. We think that Bifidobacteria longum is good, throw it in. In other words, they're haphazard collections. There's no rhyme or reason. So there's a lot of things that we could look, and there's also mistakes being made. Like some companies will double encapsulate their capsules to delay dissolution into the colon. Now, wait a minute. If half the population has microbial infestation of the small intestine, we don't want to delay release. We want to have release in the small intestine. So a lot of mistakes made. So it's getting better. And as we get smart about how to replace certain microbes, some microbes are really hard to replace. So one of the challenges, for instance, was Akkermansia muciniphila. Well, it dies upon exposure to oxygen. Well, how can you get Akkermansia if you needed it? Well, now there's methods to coat it with various polysaccharides that keep it protected. So all this is evolving. But right now, to be honest, probiotics can be helpful, but they're probably the least important of all things. At the top of the list of all things, I love this, it's just fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, right? The pickles you ferment on your kitchen counter. What's so fascinating, Rita, about fermented foods is, so let's say you ferment some cucumbers on your kitchen counter. You have to start, you can either rely on the microbes resident on the surface of the vegetable, or you can add a starter. An easy way for your listeners is buy something commercially fermented, like let's say fermented pickles. Take some of that brine, make your mix of chopped vegetables with brine, non-iodized salt, non-chlorinated water, pour some of that fermented pickle juice in there, cover it, and in a few days to weeks, you'll have fermented pickles again. It's very inexpensive. But the species of fermentation of those foods, these are species like Leuconostoc mesenteroides, Pediococcus pentaceous. These are species that mostly don't take up residence in your GI tract. So you get them, they don't take up residence, but they somehow cultivate the proliferation of healthy microbes, other healthy microbes, like Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium, lactobacillus, that in turn have all kinds of wonderful benefits for us, the host. So even though fermented foods have microbes that themselves don't take up residence, they act like farmers. They cultivate other beneficial species. That's probably the most important thing your listeners can do.
I want to talk more about fermented foods and fermentation because that's a very exciting topic. So when I was researching this topic, I was like, oh, fermentation, and you can do like different foods and like how to do it. But we're going to talk more about that. I want to talk about this one microbe that you alluded to earlier, Lactobacillus reuteri. Now, this is one of your most exciting things that you stumbled across. Let's talk about it in depth. What is it? And what is it going to do for gut problems like SIBO and other things that we are dealing with?
Rena, by sheer dumb luck, it was the first microbe I chose to play with, and it's probably the most important. There's many important microbes, but this one stands apart as being so important. So recall that it has the capacity to colonize the entire GI tract from mouth to anus, including the 24 feet of small intestine, where it takes up residence, produces bacteriocins. So that's a big part of its good behavior. The other aspect, of course, that it sends that signal through the vagus nerve up to the brain to release that hormone oxytocin. So people call oxytocin the hormone of love and empathy. I also call it the hormone of shape and body composition. Because when you restore reuteri in people who've lost it, which is everybody, by the way, almost nobody has it anymore. Very interestingly, Dr. Gerhard Reuter, a German microbiologist, discovered this microbe in 1962 in a German mother's breast milk. And back then, he was an academic microbiologist. He said it's so easy to find. It's in breast milk, it's in stool, it's easy, it's everywhere. Over his 40-year career, he couldn't find it anymore. And that's been corroborated since by several groups. It's almost gone because likely it's very susceptible to common antibiotics. But you restore this lost microbe, not only does it have all those upper GI effects with the bacteriocin production, it causes the release of oxytocin, the hormone of love and empathy, and of shape and body composition. So among the effects that occur is there's a reduction in waist circumference, abdominal fat. There's a return of youthful muscle. Ladies say, oh, I don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Don't worry. Not like that. More like the musculature of youth. We lose about 35% of all our muscle as we age. And even worse, if you engage in any weight loss program that involves a reduction in calories, a GLP-1 agonist, or a bariatric procedure, you're going to lose huge amounts of muscle. And if you struggle with obesity at any time in your life, there's something that accompanies obesity called myosteatosis. All that means is not only did you have fat in your abdomen, fat invaded muscle. Myosteatosis. And when fat invades muscle, it further inflames and impairs muscle. And so add that all together. Age-related loss of muscle, myosteatosis, loss of oxytocin that builds muscle. And that's what it's setting you up for: loss of independence, falls, fracture, frailty, and premature death. That's another issue here. We now have very good evidence in huge databases, NHANES, Epic Norfolk, and others, that people who lose weight the wrong way, and I would classify the wrong way as anytime you reduce calories, a pharmaceutical, a bariatric procedure, you will lose muscle. You're going to die several years younger. This is a terrible thing, Rena. So in other words, if you're obese, you're going to die younger, maybe 8 years younger than you should have. If you lose weight the wrong way, you're going to die younger. So all the things we're talking about, that is the diet, restoration of reuteri. We also go farther in a lot of my programs. We also restore things. So there's this awful mistake that was made. Cut your fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol caused modern people to abandon consumption of organ meats like brain, tongue, and heart, and stomach, and thereby lost sources of collagen and hyaluronic acid. And those two have huge effects on where fat is located and how much muscle you have. And so we restore those things. Now, unfortunately, most people, modern people, say, oh, I'm not going to eat any brain. I'm not going to eat any liver. So we resort to supplements, or maybe do some things like slow cook our meats, maybe fold in the skin of chicken, things like that. But no bone broth, by the way. Bone broth, when used prolonged boiling with vinegar, we now know is a high source of lead. So I tell people, don't make bone broth, make carcass broth. It sounds terrible. But so you bake your chicken, say, you eat whatever you want, save the carcass that has skin, tendons, ligaments, meat, maybe some of the organs if you have it. Boil it for only a few hours, maybe 3 hours, 4 hours. Don't add vinegar. So you won't get the high levels of lead that you get from bone broth. But that's one way to get collagen, or collagen supplements. Hyaluronic acid, Rena, is so interesting. I know ladies all say, oh, I know all about it. I put it right here as a serum for $120 an ounce. I said, no. You do that, what happened to the skin on your neck or thighs or nothing. The real power of hyaluronic acid is taken orally. It adds dermal collagen, so you get smoother skin. It causes retention of moisture. You get more plumpness. Ladies love that. It helps deposit more collagen in your joint cartilage. It adds to the lubricating synovial fluid in your joints. And it's a fiber, Irina. It's one of the few fibers we get from animals. And it's a wonderful bloomer in all those beneficial species that magnify the benefits of fermented foods. So fermented pickles or whatever, with hyaluronic acid, you get a bloom. Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium, Lactobacillus, all those wonderful species, and it reduces endotoxin too. So hyaluronic acid is this massively underappreciated fiber that's absent from the modern diet. We just add it back.
I think that my audience would absolutely love that because they're mostly animal based. So anything that is like an animal based something, they're going to love that. I want to talk about this yogurt. That it's a yogurt. It can be made with other things. Okay, so it's going to promote the Lactobacillus reuteri. How do you make this yogurt?
So you need a microbe to start with. So I formulated a product that provides it's called My Reuteri. That's one way to do it. I've shifted away from some of the previous sources. We've studied our microbe in animals and in humans and stand by its effects. So I tried to make an affordable way. The good thing about this is if you buy a source of the microbe and you make yogurt out of it, so we're going to use prolonged fermentation, 36 hours. I use organic half and half. I know you don't have half and half in Australia, but it's half cream, half whole milk. That's all it is. I add a little bit of inulin to feed it. It's like throwing cow manure on your garden. You're going to have bigger and more tomatoes. That's all it is. So we ferment for 36 hours at human body temperature. So reuteri, it helps when people are trying to understand how to ferment things. It helps think of microbes in two general categories. Microbes that ferment at room temperature, like that Leuconostoc and Pediococcus, and microbes that ferment at human body temperature, like the Bacillus reuteri, like the Bacillus gasseri, because two different temperatures. So we're going to ferment reuteri at human body temperature, so about 37 degrees Celsius, for 36 hours. You get a very thick. I start with organic half and half, meaning 18% fat, because we don't care about fat. Fat's fine. Dairy fat is the hell. Dairy has issues, but the fat is the least problematic. So we're going to leave that fat in there. And then we have a half cup or 120 milliliters per day with chia seeds, flaxseed, blueberry, whatever. And that's where you get all these big effects. So part of the magic here is the super duper high counts of microbes that we get from prolonged fermentation.
Okay, I'm going to put the link, the full recipe, because you have a blog post which actually lists everything. It's fantastic of how to make this and all the benefits, everything that you mentioned. It's going to be in the description of this video. It's called, I'm going to call it Fix the Microbiome, the yogurt recipe. People can go there, click on it, and they'll see everything. I want to talk about the solution in terms of dietary protocols, which you alluded to earlier, things that we can do, and then fermentation and fermented foods. First of all, why is full fat everything important?
Fat is satiating. It can cause you to stay away from garbage foods. If you're full because you had lots of fat from bacon, from butter, from the marbling in meat, from full fat ground beef, you're satisfied. And food, you know this, but it tastes so much better. I think about the days 30, 40 years ago when we used to tell people low fat, low sodium. Food tasted horrible. It was disgusting. And so, by the way, we also reject the need to limit salt. That's nonsense. That came from yet another mistake made in dietary guidelines. The proliferation of processed, ultra-processed foods, grains, and sugars causes insulin resistance that causes sodium retention. So the FDA wrongly blamed the salt, not the insulin resistance coming from the shift in diet. So we're going to undo all those things. So one of the things that happens early on, you probably see this in your programs, is there's a diuresis. You lose a lot of water at first. And people actually get lightheaded. In the early days, we had people pass out. We'd have to stop their blood pressure medication. We'd have to tell them to hydrate, salt their water, salt their food. So everything flip-flops. We do the exact opposite, and it works great. And there's almost I'm not sure I've ever seen a person who was persistently hypertensive on the program. High blood pressure, just as it happens in, say, the Hadza, the Maasai, the Malawi, the other indigenous populations, they have no hypertension unless they eat our food.
I have a weird question for you. What do you think about bacon, along with having the Lactobacillus reuteri, along with having fermented foods? What do you think about bacon to fix the microbiome?
Good question. I don't know. I've never heard that before.
Okay, because I would think that along with higher fat foods, full of good fat, along with the fermented foods, that would help your overall health and also keep the good bacteria there and control the bad bacteria.
You're getting into an area that's not well sorted out, I believe. That is because there's a bunch of bile acid issues in there, secondary bile acids, that I'm not sure I understand well. I'm not sure anybody understands it well yet. It's one of the things coming out, say, in some people's shift towards carnivory and ketogenic diets, where there's often, not always, but often a lack of fibers. And one of the things that can happen is the proliferation of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria and a shift in secondary bile acid. So very confusing stuff, Rena. I'm not sure I have a grasp on that. It's unclear what the long-term consequences are of that.
Okay. I want to ask you about the incorporation of quality meats. By that, I mean not eating meats that have been fed corn and wheat and all these different things and grains.
So, as you know, and antibiotics. So, meats grown organically, pastured, etc., tend to have a lower linoleic acid content, a little higher linolenic acid content, a form of omega-3. Of course, don't have additives added, like antibiotics and other things. Hormones becoming less and less of an issue. I know in the U.S., antibiotics are supposed to be outlawed in the last several weeks before killing an animal. It doesn't always happen. It's not as if the USDA is tightly policing farmers, so things get done. But in general, even organic produce, of course, not always organic. But if you shift in that direction, you're a little bit better off.
And the inclusion of organ meats, you mentioned brain and liver. I don't know if people they want to have that, but that's also important as well for the microbiome and the gut health and your gut health.
Probably, as well as for collagen, hyaluronic acid, and other nutrients. Yeah, but it's a tough sell, Rena, very tough sell. I heard a trick yesterday from a woman who says she goes to a butcher and she has to ask specifically to get like 10 pounds of ground beef with a pound of liver, bovine liver, and a pound of heart ground into it. And she feeds that to her family. She says they can't tell the difference, yet they're getting a higher nutrient and fat and collagen content without them knowing. But it is hard. The last time I tried to buy cow hearts, the butcher made me sign a release. Yeah, so in case I was going to do something bad, like who knows, leave it on somebody's porch or something like that.
Well, I think if we can include some organ meats, that's good. I've heard if we have some ground beef, just put in some, ground liver and the butcher can do that and then you can't really, really taste it. But a nutrient dense diet is very important. And along with that is fermented foods. Can you talk about what is fermentation? Because even for me, that was really new. What is that and why is it beneficial to our gut microbiome?
So it's just the microbes' production of certain metabolites. So if we eat something, we convert it to a bunch of metabolites. Could be amino acids, could be fatty acids, could be vitamins, minerals, fibers. Microbes are similar. Their bodies are different, of course, and much more simple, but they still metabolize, let's say, fiber, like fructooligosaccharides or inulin, to lactic acid or acetate. They make that process is called fermentation. And there's also, of course, alcoholic fermentation to make ethanol. There's that also. It's just a name for a form of fermentation that bacteria engage in. But we can put that to use. So one of the great products of fermentation, of course, is butyrate or butyric acid. Is your audience interested in skin health a lot?
Are you kidding? Who isn't?
So one of my projects involves a lot of skin, man. One of our recent clinical trials involves skin. So here's a great thing to know about fermented foods. So you eat that fermented food, fermented whatever, carrots, asparagus, cabbage, sauerkraut, pickles, whatever. Those microbes, Luganostoc, Mesenteroides, Pediococcus, they pass through. They don't take up they don't colonize the GI tract. They cultivate species. Those ones I mentioned, the Akkermansia, Faecal, those are called butyrogenic species. butyric acid producing species. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. It's a little complicated, but a little interesting. So those butyrate producing species produce butyric acid. The butyric acid, in addition to doing great things like healing your gut and giving you deep sleep with dreams, reducing blood sugar, also goes to the skin and acidifies the skin. So healthy skin is acidic, pH about 4.5. Unhealthy skin, like in somebody with acne, rosacea, psoriasis, eczema, seborrhea, they have much less acidic skin, typically a pH about 5.5. You may remember, pH scale is logarithmic, so healthy skin is tenfold more acidic than unhealthy skin. Well, that degree of acidity encourages the proliferation of a beneficial skin microbe, Staphylococcus epidermidis, and suppresses the proliferation of an unhealthy microbe, Staphylococcus aureus, which many people have heard of. Now, those people with acne, eczema, psoriasis, etc., are filled body-wide with Staphylococcus aureus all over this. So even if you have acne on your face or eczema on your hands, you've got Staphylococcus aureus everywhere, in your ears, on your buttocks, on your abdomen, on your back. So this fermented foods, and by the way, hyaluronic acid, blooms butyrogenic species. Butyrate acidifies the skin, tips the scales towards epidermidis and away from aureus. You get moister, smoother skin, and it discourages, it helps get rid of those. There's more you can do, but it helps get rid of those skin conditions. So this proves to be a great strategy for skin health.
So it sounds like it's working on the inside out, so helping with microbes, flourishing the good ones, and then that goes into all aspects of the body. And the skin is the largest organ, so obviously you're going to have good skin health. I want to ask about diversity of fermented foods rather than just sticking with one thing. Like I'm just going to eat sauerkraut. I'm just going to eat kimchi. Diversity is important. Why?
Not entirely clear. But one of the diversity in the microbiome is important, and diversity, you're right, in the fibers you take as well as the fermented foods you take. No one yet has the magic formula. Here's how to do it. But it is clear that healthier people have more diverse microbiomes, and you get more diversity by generating more diversity in your diet, including diversity in your fermented foods. So you're exactly right. You probably get maximum benefit. So that we rely on the Sonnenberg study. Justin and Erica, the two Stanford scientists who did that very large, very nice study, where they had people eat either a lot of fibers metabolized by microbes or a whole bunch of fermented foods, like 6, 7, 8 servings per day. Doesn't have to be big, but small servings. And hands down, it was the variety of fermented foods that generated the greatest diversity in the gut microbiome. That's only one study, but it's a very thorough study. But it suggests to us that lots of variation in your fermented food consumption is probably one of the most important things you can do.
So if we have the yogurt recipe and we have some other fermented foods in our diet, how much do we have to have each day?
Don't know. So probably lots. So the best we have is that Sonnenberg study where it was 6, 7, or 8 servings per day. By a serving, I mean a couple of tablespoons of kimchi, maybe a little bit of sauerkraut with your sausages. Here's a trick that makes it real easy. I ferment juices. Now, a lot of your listeners are low carb, as we are too. But when you ferment juices, you ferment the sugars out. So one real easy thing to do is I love helping people save money. So let's ferment Bacillus subtilis, because Bacillus subtilis is magnificent. It germinates in the ileum, in the small intestine, and is a master at producing bacteriocins. Now, the two I mentioned earlier, reuteri, gasseri, are mostly effective in killing, if you remember from microbiology, the gram-negative fecal microbes. They're not so good at eradicating the gram-positive fecal microbes, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Enterococcus. Well, Bacillus subtilis is a champion at producing bacteriocins that kill both gram-negative and gram-positive. And here's a really cheap way to do it. Go to Aldi's. And for $2.19, Rena, do you have Aldi's in Australia?
Yeah.
Oh, well, at least in the U.S. it's called a kombucha. It's not a kombucha, but it tastes like kombucha. But it's made with Bacillus subtilis. Looks like subtilis, Subtilis. So it's a brand called Vital Life, Vitalife. There's some other brands. Doesn't have to be Aldi, doesn't have this product, but look for a kombucha that is made with Bacillus subtilis. It's specifically the DE111 strain. Take about a half cup of that, pour it into any volume of juice. Just make sure there's no preservatives, potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, that kind of stuff, because they inhibit the growth of microbes. So take a half cup, pour it into the juice. You might have to pour a little juice off to make room. Cap, agitate lightly, keep it 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So one thing we forgot to mention is you need a device that you can change temperatures. In this case, we're going to keep it at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. What's that, about 33, I think, 33, 34 Celsius for 60 hours, because we don't want any sugar. So at 60 hours, taste it. If it's a little sweet still, let it go another 12, 24 hours. Leave that cap on loosely, because you're going to see after about 24 to 48 hours, it's bubbling like crazy. It's producing carbon dioxide. And if the cap's on too tightly, it will explode in your kitchen, literally explode. So let's say after 60 hours, now you have a low-carb juice with very little residual sugar and a huge source of Bacillus subtilis, this small intestine a microbe that is terrific for producing a wide range of bacteriocins. So that is one, and there's some other tricks like that. You can do the same thing with Bacillus coagulans, all kinds of things. And you can that's an easy, fun way, because you're going to have sparkling juices. Maybe a little more interesting maybe than fermented pickles, but it's another way to add to variety.
So what you're saying is that all this is in a framework. Your audience is primarily low carb, so we can still make this low carb. I have a question about ketogenic diets. You're not a fan of a ketogenic diet for the long term because you're missing these fermented foods and the microbes, the bacteria that we need in our gut. Is that correct?
Yeah. So as you know, there are as many versions of the ketogenic diet as there are advocates of the ketogenic diet. Everybody's has their own little different spin on it. But so we know that for a century, a ketogenic diet has been studied because it was an advantage for children with intractable grand mal seizures, which are very dangerous, terrifying. Your 4-year-old's having 12, 15 seizures a day and experiencing brain damage as a result. So medication's not working. So it was discovered about a century ago that a ketogenic diet was beneficial in reducing seizure frequency by about 50%. They weren't cured, but it reduced seizure frequency. Now, back then, they used a weird form of the ketogenic diet where they upped corn oil a ton. Of course, that was a mistake. Now it's more like MCTs and coconut oil and other oils. But even so this question has been asked, what happens to those kids put on ketogenic diets? Well, they stop growing, so they're very short. They develop osteoporosis as teenagers. They have a lot of kidney stones, especially calcium oxalate kidney stones. And there's the occasional cardiomyopathy, heart muscle disease, and occasional sudden cardiac death. So there are things here we don't fully understand. But there is also clear that there's also, if you fail to take in fibers. So the Achilles heel is not fat. It's not the ketones. It's the failure to feed the microbes in your GI tract. So what happens if you fail to feed them? Because you eliminated asparagus and radishes and jicama and onions and garlic and shallots. Well, many species decline in numbers, so you lose species diversity. But there are selected species that, while they love fibers, will have the advantage, like Akkermansia muciniphila, mucus lover. So Akkermansia is normally a beneficial microbe if it occupies about 4 to 5% of your entire microbiome. But when you deprive it of fibers, other species are declining. Akkermansia proliferates wildly. So it increases from 4 to 5% of the microbiome to 18%, 24%, 36%. When that happens, it's eating your intestinal mucus barrier. And it can cause colitis, intestinal inflammation. It increases endotoxemia, the entry of microbial breakdown products into the bloodstream. That's why I believe people say things like this: I'm doing great. I'm ketogenic or carnivorous. My triglycerides dropped. I lost 47 pounds. My waist shrunk by 8 inches. I feel great. And about 18 months in or thereabouts, they say, something's weird. My triglycerides have bounced back up to 210. My HDL dropped. My blood glucose went from 90 to 115. I'm regaining weight in my abdomen. And people say, well, you're not doing the diet. And they say, I am doing the diet. This is from the overproliferation of Akkermansia and other species like Parabacteroides and the resultant increase in endotoxemia and intestinal inflammation. So you can use it as a tool in the near term, but you have to be very careful and mindful of fiber intake. Now, people don't always agree with that, but I think the weight of evidence suggests that. And you know what? When in doubt, do it the way wild humans have done it for centuries. And most species of humans are not purely carnivorous or ketogenic. There's nothing wrong with ketosis per se, nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with eating meat and organs per se. It's the absence of fiber.
It's interesting when you're talking to a broad audience and people follow their protocols that work for them. But what you're saying is high fat is important, quality meat is important. The addition of fermented foods, because you're feeding your microbes, which have their own colony and their own kind of community. And it's so interesting that I think there is 10 trillion cells in our body, but 100 trillion bacteria in our body. So we are more bacteria than cells. But I do want to be mindful of the people that are doing a carnivore ketogenic diet, that, as you said, in the short term, but maybe in the longer term, we don't know the outcome. Just so that people are not like, wow, Dr. Davis said this and Rena said this. Oh my God, we hate them now. No, inclusive of everyone. The discussion is microbes, fermented foods, and the lactobacillus reuteri, the yogurt drink, to help with that. And all the information is going to be on the Primal Labs. Last question for you. We kind of touched upon it in the terms of the biggest gut problems that people face. You think that a lot of people have SIBO, small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, and don't even know it?
Absolutely. Rita, I would not have believed it if you just told me that until we started testing left and right with the air device and thousands of people. Because I thought SIBO was this rare thing. That, dysbiosis confined to the colon, that's common. But I thought small intestinal bacteria was rare. No, it's everywhere. Here's one perspective. If we looked at the dozens of studies that ask this question, these kind of questions, in condition blank, what proportion tests positive for SIBO? Usually breath testing for hydrogen gas. There are other methods too. Well, how about in irritable bowel syndrome? So in the U.S., there's an astounding 60 to 70 million people, with irritable bowel syndrome. Well, it varies from study to study, but about 31% will test positive. So that's 31%. It's about 18 million people right there. How about in obesity? What proportion tests positive? Well, there's 115 million obese Americans, 50% test positive. That's another 55 or so plus billion. How about type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, fibromyalgia, restless leg syndrome, sleep apnea, neurodegenerative conditions? Add all, you'll see there's overlap, of course, but there's easily over 150 million people with SIBO. It's everywhere. Another perspective is in all those studies. So let's say we want to study what's the incidence of SIBO in people with ulcerative colitis. So people with ulcerative colitis, maybe 44% test positive, and they include a healthy control group. How many of the healthy controls test positive? It varies, but typically 6 to 44%. In other words, the healthy controls are not healthy controls. So, Rena, it is everywhere. Now, I suspect we don't even know all the things that lead down this path. So, yes, antibiotics, glyphosate, chlorinated drinking water, stomach acid blocking drugs, birth control pills, anti-inflammatory drugs, on and on. I suspect there's more. We don't even know all the things that lead us down this path because it's so darn ubiquitous. I've had it. Everybody I know, with almost rare exceptions, have had it. At least SIBO, if not many times, and many with SIFO also. So I do suspect there's something else going on that's driving it we had not yet identified.
How does that relate to other gut issues like celiacs, ulcerative colitis? What's the other one? Leaky gut?
I think we underestimate. So this testing hydrogen gas is not a perfect method. It's a pretty good method, but it's not a perfect method. Uh, in some ways, a better method is to have endoscopy and have an aspirate of your duodenum or upper jejunum, but that's invasive. And typically, most hospitals and clinics don't have the capacity to do DNA testing. They do culturing. So they'll say, Rena, we didn't get anything, but they didn't do the right test. And so we have this hole. So I believe we're underestimating. I mean, we're talking about 50% of the population. I think it's true also in Australia as much as here and Western Europe. I think it's worse than that. But we need better methods to identify this process. So far, I'm grateful that Dr. Angus Short in Dublin, Ireland, invented this thing.
Can you tell us the name? What's the name of the one that you use?
So this is the original AIRE, AIRE, from Food Marble. This is the more recent one. So this measures hydrogen gas. This measures hydrogen gas and methane. The methane is not all that important. That's an archaea issue. Methanogenic species. So, and this one you can get much cheaper, I think, nowadays. But he made this for his wife. He's a PhD engineer, and his wife had irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and was told to go on that diet that came from the Australian University, Monash, put on a low FODMAPs diet. And he saw her getting tripped up and getting bloating and diarrhea. So he invented this device to measure hydrogen gas to see when she tripped up. Well, I get it in 2018. I call him. I said, Angus, no, this is a mapping device. So they changed the whole conversation. But he invented something that is a mapping device to tell you where microbes are living. But I don't want your listeners to think they have to have it. I tell you what really helps, Rena, is let's say you have SIBO because you're intolerant to FODMAPs and histamine-containing foods. And maybe you see fat droplets in the toilet from fat malabsorption, because when fecal microbes are in the duodenum, it blocks the action of pancreatic enzymes and bile, so you can't digest fats. So you see fat floating in the toilet. Well, you do the SIBO yogurt, say, and 4 weeks later, no more fat in the toilet. You now can eat tomatoes and eggplant and all those and cheese, all that stuff. So you think so your original symptoms were food intolerances and those, let's just say, fat malabsorption. 6 months later, you have a panic attack. You say, what the heck's going on here? You test, you're positive. So what can happen is, let's say the original SIBO was dominated by Salmonella and Enterobacter, those gram-negative species. The recurrence could be dominated by Staphylococcus and Enterococcus. Different microbes, different effects. So that's where it gets tricky. And that's where I think the real usefulness of this device is, to identify if you have some weird thing happen to you. Is this SIBO or is it not? And this will, I'll tell you.
Incredible. I'm going to try to find the links for all those devices and put it in the blog post of the Primal Labs. Dr. Davis, I mean, this was just absolutely incredible. People will learn more from you than they'll ever learn in any, school or college or anything about the microbiome. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to see more of you?
Well, thank you, Rita. That was very nice. So my websites, I have William Davis, MD. That's my blog with several thousand blog posts. I have a terrible named website that's membership where we do this every week practically. It's called innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. And of course, I have those products I released also. As my reuteri, that's one of the ways to get started making the yogurt.
Wonderful. All the links are going to be in the description, so people can just click for Dr. William Davis. Incredible. Thank you so much for your time. Honestly, I really appreciate it. I said earlier prior to starting that when we have people like you that just explain things that are just common sense and make sense, but in a very simple way, it's just an honor to have people like you in our world. And thank you for all the work that you do.
No, thank you, Rena. Thanks for all the things you're doing.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. William Davis. Now, if you'd like to know more information about everything that we discussed, gut health, gut microbiome, plus that yogurt recipe for the L-reuteri, just head to the description of this video, click the top link, open that up, and you'll see all the information there about how to fix your gut health and that yogurt recipe. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button because that's an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram and on X under the name of the Primal Podcast. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Zoe Harcum. We're discussing everything cholesterol, including triglycerides LDL and HDL cholesterol, Dr. Zoe Harcum breaks down what actually causes heart disease, why it's not cholesterol, and why if you're on a statin, that's going to increase your chance of heart disease. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.